You have surely heard the phrase, "remember the Alamo," at some point in your life, but chances are you weren't alive in 1836, so you probably don't remember anything about the Battle of the Alamo. You probably heard about it in school though, because it's one of the most influential battles in Texan history. In this video, we'll discuss what the Battle of the Alamo was, why it was such a big deal, and where the phrase "remember the Alamo" comes from. Before Texas was part of the United States, it was its own country called the Republic of Texas. And before it was the Republic of Texas, it was part of Mexico. The Battle of the Alamo would have never happened if Texas had been fine with continuing to be part of Mexico. But in typical Texas fashion, they just had to go their own way. This was a large part because Mexico abolished slavery in Texas in 1830, but Texas wanted to keep slavery around. In order to do this, they would have to break away. Texas wasn't the only area that wanted to break away from Mexico, but they were the only ones who succeeded. They became the Republic of Texas in 1836 and would remain their own country separate from Mexico and the United States for the next 10 years. Mexico never recognized them as a real country and always considered Texas to be just a rebellious province. Texas didn't think they needed Mexico's permission to be a country, so they just continued on with what they were doing. Mexican President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna was not happy with the fact that Texas was breaking away and kicking out all of the Mexican troops, so he vowed to reclaim the land for Mexico. The Mexican Congress passed the Tornel Decree, which declared that anyone fighting Mexican troops will be deemed pirates and dealt with as such, being citizens of no nation presently at war with the Republic and fighting under no recognized flag. Santa Anna arrived in San Antonio de Bexar, near modern-day San Antonio, with about 1,500 troops and his sights set on the Alamo, which the Texans were using as a fort. The Alamo, officially named the Alamo Mission, was founded by Spanish Catholic missionaries in the 18th century. Lieutenant Colonel William Travis, who was in charge at the Alamo, wrote letters to the Texan and American governments asking for more men and more supplies, since he knew they were hopelessly outnumbered. Less than 100 reinforcements showed up, and there were only about 200 total soldiers at the Alamo when they were attacked. The United States wouldn't send reinforcements because they had a treaty with Mexico, and arming the Alamo would have been an act of war. Of course, after the United States annexed Texas, they would have their own war with Mexico later. Sam Houston, who was the president of Texas at the time, knew the Alamo was a lost cause. He sent men to remove all their artillery and destroy the whole building so that the Mexicans wouldn't be able to use it as a base after they left. Commanders James Bowie and William Travis, however, disagreed with this decision and decided to stay and fight. Bowie wrote in the letter that the salvation of Texas depends on the great measures of keeping Bexar out of the hands of the enemy. It serves as the frontier picket guard, and if it were in possession of Santa Anna, there is no stronghold from which to repel him in his march towards the Sabine. He also wrote that Colonel Neal and myself have come to the solemn resolution that we will rather die in these ditches than give it up to the enemy. Some reinforcements arrived, including most notably famous frontiersman Davy Crockett. However, they were still outnumbered nearly 10-1. When scouts alerted them that Santa Anna was within sight, they gathered what food they could from the nearby town and retreated to the Alamo. Virtually all of them would never leave. Santa Anna raised a red flag, meaning no quarter. No quarter means no surrender, even unconditional surrender, and that you're out to kill the enemy rather than take prisoners. It is against modern international humanitarian laws to declare that no quarter will be given. Luckily for Santa Anna, modern international humanitarian laws didn't exist yet. The Mexican army laid siege to the Alamo for 13 days. During those 13 days, there were some skirmishes here and there, but nothing decisive. During this siege, Travis wrote a letter, which has come to be called "To the People of Texas and All Americans in the World." After his opening line in the letter, he asked the settlers to come to his aid. It was widely distributed throughout Texas and eventually America as well as Europe. However, at the time, it did little to help. Travis ends the letter with the now infamous line, "If this call is neglected, I am determined to sustain myself as long as possible and die like a soldier who never forgets what is due to his own honor and that of his country, victory or death." While Travis never got the reinforcements he wanted, Santa Anna got about 1,000 more troops sent to him as he prepared to end the siege and take the Alamo. Many of Santa Anna's officers wanted to wait and prolong the siege, dragging it out until artillery had totally destroyed the walls and the Texans would be forced to surrender. Santa Anna didn't want to surrender. He wanted a decisive victory that would send a strong message to everyone currently rebelling against Mexico, not just the Texans. When the Mexican army launched their attack, troops who were from the area were purposefully not placed on the front line, so that the odds of them having to shoot or stab someone they personally knew would be reduced. They didn't plan on taking prisoners, but at least they didn't want to see someone bayonet their own neighbor. At the very beginning of the battle, it seemed as though there was a chance that the Texan defenders might actually have a chance of winning. The Mexican army advanced in a column formation that only allowed the front lines to fire. However, many of the troops in the back were inexperienced new recruits, and they fired anyway, unintentionally hitting many of their own men. As the Mexican army scaled the walls and broke in, at least 80 Texan defenders attempted to escape and were killed by the Mexican cavalry. The battle lasted about an hour, and virtually all of the Texan soldiers were killed, going down fighting all the way to the bitter end. Only a handful of Texans surrendered, between 4 and 7. Precise numbers are hard to come by when it comes to chaotic historical events like this one. Some historians believe that Davy Crockett could have been among those who surrendered. A former slave who worked as a cook for one of Santa Anna's officers claimed that Crockett's body had been found surrounded by no less than 16 Mexican corpses. Like many things surrounding the life of Davy Crockett, nobody really knows if this is true. General Manuel Fernandez Castrillon attempted to convince Santa Anna that the Texans who surrendered should be taken prisoner. Santa Anna had no interest in prisoners, and so they were all executed by sword immediately. The rest of the survivors were women and children, who Santa Anna did let go. Even he wasn't going to go that far. Despite having a huge numerical advantage, the Mexican army suffered a severe casualty rate. Most historians estimate that somewhere between 400 and 600 Mexican soldiers were killed or wounded at the Alamo, which would have been about a third of their entire force. Santa Anna attempted to downplay the heavy loss, saying that the Alamo was but a small affair. One of his officers famously remarked that, with another such victory as this, we'll go to the devil. A fitting statement for what would ultimately amount to a very hollow victory for Santa Anna. Santa Anna believed that the crushing loss at the Alamo would put an end to the resistance. On top of that, they still outnumbered the Texans 6-1, even taking their recent heavy casualties into account. He thought that he had scored a major propaganda victory, and that the rest of the army would flee or surrender. However, the Alamo ended up having the exact opposite effect. It served as a rallying cry for Texas, and many new men joined the Texan army. The New York Post wrote at the time that had Santa Anna treated the vanquished with moderation and generosity, it would have been difficult, if not impossible, to awaken the general sympathy for the people of Texas, which now impels so many adventurers and ardent spirits to throng to the aid of their brethren. It seemed as though Santa Anna's brutal tactics had backfired. The Texans' armies, with fresh and inspired reinforcements, launched a surprise attack that caught the Mexican army unprepared. This battle, the Battle of San Jacinto, was over in just 18 minutes, even shorter than the Alamo. It was during this battle that the phrase, "Remember the Alamo," became immortalized. It was the rallying cry of the Texans as they chased down and killed Mexican soldiers who tried to run. Santa Anna was captured the day after the battle. He told Sam Houston, "That man may consider himself born to no common destiny who has conquered the Napoleon of the West, and now it remains for him to be generous to the vanquished." Sam Houston simply replied, "You should have remembered that at the Alamo." If this were a Tarantino movie, Sam Houston would have then cut his head off and the credits would have rolled. Instead, Santa Anna was spared, and he was forced to order all of his troops out of Texas. Perhaps the march back home was an even worse fate. He would go on to become a polarizing figure in Mexican politics. Generally speaking, executing people and losing is not a great way to become universally beloved. Because the Battle of the Alamo inspired the troops fighting in the Texas Revolution, it would also inspire many works of fiction. The first movie about the Alamo came out all the way back in 1911 and was titled The Immortal Alamo. It mostly revolves around a Mexican spy who attempts to marry one of the Texan women inside. So safe to say, it's not exactly the most historically accurate take on the subject. Even critics at the time made fun of how cheesy it was. One wrote, "Do people stop a desperate defense to go through heroics about a line and fighting to the death, or did they fight to the death without talking about it?" Chances are the critic is right. I doubt that many people at the Alamo had time to give lengthy, dramatic speeches. They were probably too busy trying not to die. The 2004 film titled The Alamo is considered by most to be the most historically accurate movie about the battle. However, it is also widely considered to be really terrible, so you might not want to watch it purely for that reason. Currently, what remains of the Alamo is in San Antonio. The building is still standing and serves as an official state shrine to the defenders of Texas. The Daughters of the Republic of Texas, an organization dedicated to preserving the memories of the original founders of the Republic of Texas, are the current caretakers of the Alamo. It has become the most popular tourist site in Texas. Perhaps the most interesting thing to remember about the Alamo is how decisions made in the heat of the moment can have drastic consequences on history. Who knows what might have happened if Santa Anna had decided to take prisoners after all, or if Travis had decided to abandon the Alamo before the Mexican army even arrived. The history of the United States as we know it could look quite different.